Hi class, welcome. I am Dr. Eimer Brink, and I wanted to do a little bit of kind of a mini lecture every week to go over some of the material that we'll be covering. So I'm going to pick a few slides from the PowerPoints that I've posted and really sort of go into that in greater depth. As I talked with you about whenever we had met, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. We can schedule some time to meet during office hours and kind of talk about any further questions that you have in greater detail. So for chapter 1, I'm actually going to create 2 separate videos. The first video we're going to have today is going to talk about some of the initial theories that your book has. And then in our second part of our video lecture, I'm going to go into some of the research methods. Now, if you've taken a research methods class in the past, some of that might seem familiar to you, but we can never get research methods too many times. I think it'll be a really great place for us to continue understanding how research works, particularly in developmental psychology. So let's go ahead and get started for today. All right, so this is our first chapter in personality and social development. If we were together in class, the first thing I would kind of talk about is what are the goals of developmental psychology or developmental science? And there are a couple of things here that we can look at. First, we want to be able to provide some sort of description, right? We want to be able to observe individuals' behaviors, and we want to see how that person is changing over the course of the lifespan. And that's really important, is that change, that growth that we're looking at. In terms of kind of developmental psychologists, they also want to be able to provide an explanation. Why? Why do human beings develop in the way that they do? Why, if we both experience the exact same situation, is my response going to be different from someone else's response, right? Your response. And you might see this with your siblings all the time, right? You grew up in the same family, but yet there are differences between you. Developmental psychologists are also looking to make predictions, right? So kind of collecting data. If I put a person in this situation and they have these specific experiences, how might they respond to that? And then finally, particularly those of you who are interested in going into clinical psychology, right? Maybe thinking about interventions. How do we optimize development? How do we, take the research that we know and really enhance a person's life? So when we think about developmental psychology, we need to understand that there is this intricate interlay of different processes that are occurring. So when we think about our development, when we think about who we are or how we develop in the way that we do, it's a combination of our biology, our cognition, and our socio-emotional processes. And all of these things sort of work together. So, for example, think about a baby and a baby smiling in response to a touch that they receive from their parents. The response that that child is going to give depends on the biological process, right? So kind of the experience of touch itself, the responsiveness to that touch, the cognitive processes, so the child's ability to kind of understand the intentionality of that act, right? What does that mean? And then finally, the socio-emotional processes, the act of smiling, or the understanding that the act of smiling reflects a positive emotion and feeling, and that smiling helps us connect with our caregiver or this person that is providing that touch in a way that might facilitate that ongoing interaction. right? So development doesn't just happen in a silo. In fact, development is an intersection of multiple processes coming together. So one thing we might kind of think about or look at here is, heredity and experience. We're going to kind of talk about this with theories of sort of nature and nurture a little bit here in a couple of slides. But I want to address a couple of myths that people have when we think about that relationship between heredity and experience. So the first myth is that behavior with biological origin, so with a biological origin, is fixed and cannot be affected by experience. This is very much untrue. And I think over the course of the semester, we're actually going to see this, that experience can profoundly impact our behaviors and the way that we act and interact with our environment. The second myth is stating that biologically determined propensities must be present at birth. So you either have it or you don't. We would consider this to be a myth. In fact, we can actually create very positive environments to help facilitate learning and growth. And so if we either were born with something or we're not going to have it, then why should any of us really bother that sort of learning process, right? So this would be another myth. Myth number 3, biologically based behaviors must remain stable over time and are not susceptible to change. This is untrue. In fact, a lot of our development is highly plastic. It's ever changing. And your book really sort of talks about this as well. And so kind of thinking about these items together, right? Biology, we hear genetics, as well as experience are going to play a really important role in our development. We cannot consider them happening separately, but we really should think about how they are influencing and impacting us in terms of their relationship to each other. So, one of the questions that I would ask you, and I kind of challenge you to think about, is how do we learn behavior, right? How do you learn that you shouldn't hit another kid or steal something you like from somebody else? The truth is this really happens by a process called socialization. And it's defined by your book as a process by which we acquire beliefs, values, and behaviors that as a society we really think is desirable and appropriate. And socialization really helps a society function, and it does so in 3 very, very important ways. The first is it helps us to regulate our behavior. It then helps us to promote our own individual growth, and last and perhaps most importantly, it really perpetuates social order. Could you imagine if everyone just did whatever they wanted to do without thinking about its consequence to others? Okay. So let's move on to kind of talk about some of the theories of development. I'm going to just go over these rather briefly with you all, but these are important and crucial theories to understand as we move throughout the remainder of this course. So please do spend time taking a look at these theories, really understanding them, jotting down notes, using flashcards, whatever really helps you understand these theories, because you will be applying them to concepts as we move forward in the semester. So we've got 3 sort of philosophical perspectives related to development. If you've taken developmental psychology, you may have been introduced to these previously. We also talk about them in Intro to Psych as well. So the first is called original sin. It's this idea that children, when they are born as inherently selfish, right? That they want to do things only for themselves. Another theory of development is called innate purity. Here, this theory suggests that when we are born, we have an understanding of what is right and wrong, that we are born with this. The last theory of our development is related to tabula rasa, or what we call a blank slate. Children are basically born this blank slate, and we, as maybe parents, as society, then teach children, right? We are the ones that mold them into who they are. Now, each of these perspectives are slightly different, right? One is suggesting we're born inherently bad. One is suggesting we're kind of somewhere in the middle. And another, or I guess that we have the understanding of right and wrong. And then the last suggests that we are completely blank slates. Now, we've kind of added to many of these theoretical perspectives, but it's really important for us just to have a basic foundation of the theories that really help to create the field as we know it today. Another theory of development is the very famous nature versus nurture debate. I'm sure that you have heard about this before, right? So are we who we are because of our biology? Are we who we are because of our environment? Or are we who we are because of an interaction between our biology and our environment? We're sort of at the last, right? That's kind of where the research is currently, is this understanding that we are actually probably much more a combination of both our genetics and our environment than just one alone. Your book then goes on to talk about activity versus passivity. And it's this idea of how do we learn and interact with our world? Do we do so in this active sense where we are seeking out information, we are figuring out how things work? Or is it sort of passive, right? Where the world is kind of relating to us, is putting their understanding and their teachings on us. Frankly, again, probably not one or the other. More current research would probably suggest we're more in this reciprocal determinism, where, we probably have certain aspects of ourselves that cause us to interact with our environment differently, but our environment is also sort of molding and shaping us. So we call this reciprocal determinism. Okay. We then have this idea of our development. Is it continuous or is it discontinuous? Well, again, when we think about our growth, right? We might look at a child. So you see a kid and all of a sudden, so they're crawling, you come back, you see that same kid and they're walking. That might seem like it is just kind of abrupt, right? That it just sort of happens. You kind of are crawling and then you walk. We also could think about the fact that that child who was crawling probably, within that time was also practicing standing up, maybe on a couch, kind of walking along the side of the couch. We call that cruising. And then they little by little let their hands go, right? This would be much more continuous development. So while it seems like the child went from crawling to walking, right? We also really might look at the development that's happening and kind of see that maybe it's not as abrupt and it's probably a little bit more continuous, that it was the child was crawling, then they were propping themselves up, then they were cruising, and then they were stepping back and, away from that object and standing by themselves, and then they started walking. right? So there are multiple ways to sort of look at that development. Are we developing kind of continuously? Or do we have sort of abrupt changes? Is it sort of discontinuous? Okay, the last kind of theory I'd like to talk with you about here is this idea of development as being sort of universal or sort of particular. The universal aspect is that it's something that everyone goes through, right? Some sort of developmental milestone that everyone typically goes through. We consider this to be sort of normative development. So in general, right, it's a pretty normal development for children to start walking, right? That's a normal developmental thing that you can expect most kids to do. However, if you've ever noticed, you'll have a range, right? So a kid should be walking between this time to this time. And this is kind of particular to the individual. So some person, so there's sort of this normative development, but within that we have a period, right? But there's also developmental outcomes that might vary from individual to individual. And so, what one person does at 8 months, another person might not do until 13 months, right? And so this is also an important aspect of development. We get into this a bit more if you take developmental psychology. But again, I just want to outline the theories for you here so we have a really strong foundation for the rest of our chapters. All right, so I'm actually going to stop us here, and then I'm going to start another video where I'll be talking in greater depth about specific research methods that you'll be able to find in developmental psychology. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. As always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. As I mentioned, please feel free to schedule office hours. All right, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.